Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Susie Gelman. I'm the immediate past chair of Israel Policy Forum and am privileged to continue to serve on its board. I want to welcome those of you who are joining Israel Policy Forum for the first time today, and I'd like to welcome back our returning viewers. Before we begin, a big thank you to Israel Policy Forum supporters. Our work, including today's program, is made possible by you. Israel Policy Forum relies on donors like you to produce free expert analysis and informational content on the most pressing issues affecting Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you enjoy Israel Policy Forum's webinars, but don't yet support the organization's work, please do so by visiting israelpolicyforum.org/support. 30 years ago today, on September 13th, 1993, at a ceremony on the White House lawn, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat signed the Oslo I Accord and shook hands. For those of us who were there, it was a beautiful, sparkling September day, just like today. Today, though, not only does the promise of the Oslo era remain unrealized, but current trends in the Israeli-Palestinian arena threaten to undermine its achievements entirely. Nonetheless, opportunities may exist in 2023 that proved elusive in 1993, as the Biden administration reportedly seeks to leverage normalization as a catalyst for progress toward a two-state outcome. We are truly honored to be joined today by New York Times opinion columnist Thomas Friedman for a special Israel policy briefing in commemoration of this anniversary. Tom has written extensively about the current Israeli government and the Biden administration's efforts to broker a Saudi-Israel normalization deal that would require meaningful Israeli concessions on the Palestinian issue. We're especially grateful to you, Tom, for your time given your return from Kyiv just yesterday. Our conversation today will include reflections on the Oslo era, alongside analysis of today's challenges and opportunities regarding Israel's place in the Middle East. So, Tom, to kick things off, as a longtime commentator on Israeli-Arab issues, who had previously spent years as a foreign correspondent in Jerusalem and Beirut before the 1990s, how would you describe the sentiment 30 years ago today when the Oslo process made its public debut? How do you personally view the significance of this event as a journalist who has focused for decades on Israeli-Palestinian affairs?
Well, I was there at the White House as you were, and I was sat and watched my friend with my friend Steve, the late Stephen Cohen, who was a great thinker and tutor of mine on this issue. I was as hopeful as ever. I wrote the lead story in the New York Times that day about it. I never thought I'd be able to do that. And for me, as someone who's lived in Beirut, longer than I'd lived in Jerusalem as a Times correspondent, I envisaged a day when my Lebanese and Arab friends would be able to come from Beirut to Jerusalem and vice versa. And so I was full of hope, but I was also wary. I covered this region long enough and all of these characters to know that this was not a slam dunk, and just sort of took it day by day after that. And but once Rabin was assassinated, it seemed to me the wind went out of it all. And then once the second Intifada happened, it sort of crushed the peace movement. But in retrospect, I think neither side was fully committed. They both had their fingers crossed. Israel wanted peace with the Palestinians and to continue building settlements. Arafat wanted peace with Israel and to continue using violence to create pressure. And at the end of the day, because Oslo never actually, it created a kind of step-by-step process, but there were just a couple of steps and never identified a closing, endpoint. There's Haaretz has a great piece today with the peace processors, all of them friends of ours, Martin Indyk, Dennis Ross, Aaron Miller, and Jamil Galal, who is the translator for all of this. He's an Egyptian American, and he was actually the translator for all the negotiations. And I found that his perspective was the best. He said, look, Israel and Egypt made peace at Camp David because it was land for peace. It was all the land for all the peace. And Oslo was never about that. And because it was never about that, it was never actually going to realize its potential.
Mm.
I thought it was an interesting observation.
Indeed. So you've written about the potential deal that would include a significant Palestinian component, an issue you discussed with the president himself, I believe, in the Oval Office several weeks ago. So what is your assessment of President Biden's thinking on that Palestinian component?
I don't know yet, Susie. I think it's still very much in doubt and or in play. I shouldn't say in doubt. I should be very clear with everyone. I hoped it was clear from my columns, but if it isn't, let me spell it out to you as clearly as I can. I have no idea whether I will support this Saudi deal in terms of the U.S.-Saudi component. Saudi Arabia wants a civil nuclear program. It's very controversial. It wants advanced weapons, and it wants security guarantees from the United States. The United States wants to curb Saudi Arabia's contacts with China. I wrote that, it came up in the meeting I had with the president, which is really about Israel and about getting him to make a statement, which he was very happy to do in advance of the vote in the Knesset over the judicial reform. And after we got done talking about that, he said, no, I want to talk about Saudi Arabia. And so we did, but I wasn't focused on it. I only came back to it a few days later, that the United States and Saudi Arabia put on the table demands for Palestinian, advancement of the two-state solution that will blow up the Israeli cabinet. That's all I'm interested in. I have no idea right now what this will be for US Saudi. I have no idea what it'll mean for Israel Palestinian. All I care is that the Saudis, with American encouragement, help, and maybe insistence, demand that in return for normalization, demand terms that will lead to Smotrich and Ben Gvir walking out of the cabinet. Because I believe the greatest danger to Israel today is 4 years of this cabinet. So 4 years of this cabinet, and you can pack it up, folks, okay? Israel will be Turkey. It'll be its relationship with the United States will be very strained. So many of our friends will not be here, be living there. I just did a webinar, with some folks in Israel. That's really my focus right now. And what happens on the Israeli-Palestinian front, I wish it well. I hope it will be advanced. I hope normalization will be a good thing. But I raised this only, if people remember the lead I wrote. The lead I wrote was actually, hey, democracy defenders in Israel. I know you're really bummed out now because you lost the vote, but help may be on the way in the form of a US-Saudi deal that will require this cabinet to meet terms for Saudi Arabia that will blow up the cabinet. So that's really been my focus. I haven't hit it. Couldn't be more explicit about it in my column. And I'll decide on the US-Saudi deal itself later, whether I think it's good or bad or in the national interest. But I've been really focused on one thing: how do you blow up this cabinet and produce a national unity government? Because if there's 4 years of this cabinet, Saudi deal, no Saudi deal, none of it matters.
So really a follow-up to that, Tom, because as you basically have indicated, and it seems pretty apparent that any deal that would require meaningful Israeli concessions to the Palestinians would be dead on arrival in Jerusalem, given the dynamics of the current governing coalition. So I guess the question that some of us are struggling with is the president likely to go for any deal, even a bad deal? I realize you can't get in his head on this, and as you said, you're waiting to see what it actually looks like, but does it make sense for President Biden to pursue such a deal when it's not at all clear that this current government would accept it? And likely they wouldn't.
I don't know. I mean, I've been really impressed with the president's, with the president of the United States, Democratic president, has still not met with Bibi Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, was elected in November. So for all you folks out there who think Biden's like in his dotage and doesn't get it, I can assure you he gets it. And he's not only gets it, he understands actually that American Jews are with him, the vast majority, on it in his own quiet way. Yeah, Bibi, we're going to meet. Yes, I'm sure we're going to meet. And so far, they haven't met. Now, I think they will at the UN. In fact, I hope they do. I hope that they do, and that the president, speaks his mind. But he's done something pretty interesting in his own quiet, Joe Biden way, And so all I've tried to do is frame the stakes for everyone, that three things go together, okay? You can have a US-Saudi deal that blows up this cabinet, and strengthens the Israeli democracy movement and preserves the prospects of a two-state solution. Or you can have a bad Saudi deal that doesn't blow up this cabinet and destroys Israel's democracy and the two-state solution at the same time. Those are the choices. And the reason this is taking time is that everyone's wrestling with that. Bibi's lobbying for one thing. He wants a deal that can.
To our audience, Tom is having some connectivity issues. Tom, you are frozen, I'm afraid. So we'll just wait for you to unfreeze.
I'm here. I hear you just fine. Do you hear me?
Oh, okay. Okay.
I hear you just fine.
Okay. Listen, I've had those issues too. My computer sometimes freezes and it's not fun.
Not good. But anyways, so there's two deals here on the table. One is a Saudi deal that promotes a two-state solution, promotes Israeli democracy by getting rid of this cabinet, and the other is one that basically destroys a two-state solution, destroys the democracy movement in Israel by giving Bibi basically the deal of the century without having to do anything. And I just hope and pray we'll do the former and not the latter. And I've just been doing everything I can to write about that, to frame the choices in that way. That's my focus right now. Although I just got off the plane from Kiev a few hours ago, and I'm a little jet lagged. So if I'm not as normally as lucid as it's because of that.
Tom Friedman, jet lag can run circles around most normal human beings on any given day.
I'm not so sure about that, but
Tom, speak back to the Saudis, which you touched on. What they're looking for in terms of a normalization deal, they want robust security guarantees, they want advanced weapons, support for a civilian nuclear program from the US. So they want all these goodies. But what do you think the Saudis actually want on the Israeli-Palestinian front? And why do you think they've been so reticent to publicly express what Israel would have to agree to as that part of any potential deal?
Well, it's something you can't, this goes back to, in 2002, February 2002, I interviewed King Abdullah, and he unveiled his peace plan, which was actually just a knockoff of the column I wrote that was my peace plan, but never mind. And became the, actually,
I didn't realize that the king plagiarized you, Tom.
Well, actually, he began the conversation. This was at his horse farm outside of Riyadh. I've written about this. He began the conversation by saying, you broke into my drawer. I said, well, what do you mean, Your Highness? He said, you broke into my drawer. I said, well, I'm sorry, I don't understand. He said, yeah, that column you wrote, that peace plan, that's my idea. I said, oh, really? Well, tell me about it. And he told me about it. And at the end, I said, I want to write this up. This is amazing. And he said, no, you just say it yourself. I said, no, you say it. He said, no, you say it. And actually, Adel al-Jubeir, who was then the spokesman of the embassy, now the foreign minister or past foreign minister, was the translator between us. And we went back and forth, you say it, no, you say it. And finally I said, well, I'm going to write it up the way you said it. And you look it over, and if you want to own it, it's yours. And I wrote it up that way. I faxed him back the next morning, and he said, yeah, I want to own it. And that's how it came about. So, but I can tell you, when he was discussing it, he said, there'll be normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia in return for full Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. And I said, you mean East Jerusalem? I'm not sure he knew the geography.
Really?
Yeah, and I only say that to say, do not underestimate how little the Gulf Arabs know about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You put one of them down in Ramallah, I don't know, they could find their way to Jenin, real easily. And so they talk about it a lot, but in terms of the actual contours of who is where and what, there's, the Washington Institute has 10 people who understand that conflict better, the real contours of it, than anyone in Saudi Arabia or the Gulf. They do not have Israeli-Palestinian institutes that know every settlement, every road. David Mikovsky of the Washington Institute has forgotten more, than they probably know about this. That for them, it was just a symbolic issue, but they've never really gotten into the nitty gritty. And that's what they're having to do right now. and to decide, well, where actually do we want to be? What will be in advance? And so they're talking to a lot of people around the peace process, past, present, and future, to try to really get this right. I can tell you, I don't believe MBS, in his heart of hearts, I don't think it's not a big issue for it. He'd do this deal if he could without anything. They need Israel in order to get the Saudi deal through Congress. Okay, they need AIPAC to get basically Republicans to vote for this deal. And Biden needs something for the Palestinians to get Democrats to vote for the deal. So that's why it's all interlinked. But if they could have, the Saudis would have just done this tomorrow, like the UAE. I mean, just give me some, promise you won't annex, for another 5 years, and let's just do business. And how can I invest in your high-tech business? Yeah. And so do not exaggerate how much they know about this, and they're really wrestling with it and trying to fix. This is their introduction 101 to Israeli-Palestinian geography.
Is anyone calling you? Okay, well, we'll leave that one aside.
I'm just a New York Times columnist.
You're more than that. By the way, just note the UAE, they got a promise of 4 years holding off on formal annexation, but of course we see what's going on a daily basis. So I don't know if that worked out so well for the UAE in terms of
10 cents will get you a cup of coffee, so.
Right. Tom, the United States, as you know, has historically played a critical role in orchestrating Arab-Israeli diplomatic breakthroughs from Camp David to Oslo to the Abraham Accords. Do you believe the current tensions in the U.S.-Israel relations over the Netanyahu government's West Bank policies and efforts at judicial overhaul impact Washington's status as an effective broker between Israel and the Arab world?
What would affect you? I don't quite understand your question.
Given the tensions between the United States and Israel,
the
current government's West Bank policies and its efforts at judicial overhaul, how does that, if at all, impact Washington's status as an effective broker at this point between Israel and the Arab world?
It's all interlinked, really, just as I was saying, which is that how much, a U.S. Saudi-Israel normalization deal would be one of the greatest diplomatic achievements of Israel's diplomatic history, without question. But not only open up Israel to relations with the most important Muslim country, but that would be a gateway to opening up to Indonesia and Malaysia, maybe even Pakistan one day. So this is a huge deal. And if it would have come in normal times, and this is where Netanyahu shot himself in the foot. Had this just been a normal Netanyahu government, not playing around with judicial reform, people would have said, hey, it's your good luck. The Saudis decided today to do this, and you're going to benefit from that. And just as I did toward the Abraham Accords, I would have said, hey, this is a great deal. Don't care who's in power in Israel. Don't care who's in power in the White House. This is good for the region. I'm supporting it, But it happened so that it came along at a time when Netanyahu formed the most extreme government in Israel's history to save himself from political isolation at a time when he's on trial. And now he's made it very complicated, because to reward him when he's trying to destroy Israel's democracy is a very, very dangerous thing. And I'm very ambivalent about it. I'm not ambivalent about it. I'm not for it. Saudi deal can wait. Israel's lived without it. The U.S. has lived without it for a long time. Let's just do a U.S.-Saudi deal, whatever that is going to be. I haven't even opined on that, really. I don't even know if I'm for that. I got to study it because we don't even know the terms. I'm focused on one thing. How do you destroy this cabinet? By putting terms on the table that will blow it up. Everything else falls from that. And then you get a national unity government, even one if Bibi's in it, okay? Whatever it is, will be better than this cabinet, because 4 years of this cabinet, the two-state solution is gone and Israel is gone. So as we know it, Israel will be Turkey. It'll be some other kind of really ambivalent and ambiguous country in terms of U.S.-Israel relations and U.S.-Jewish-Israel relations.
As you wrote, it won't be the country that you want your grandson to love. No,
look, this is, I told everyone from the very beginning, I got a lot of, pushback, to say the least, when I wrote the day after the election. The Israel you knew is over. And people say, well, come on, it's what are you talking about? A few people understood, like my friend Nahum Barnea, what I was saying. I was in Israel as a correspondent when Mayor Kahane, the real deal, was in the Knesset. Shamir used to walk out when Kahane got up. Netanyahu just ushered these guys in to the coalition and gave them national security power. I knew that. These are not people you went to Camp Ramah with. These are not people who were in the cabin next to you in the Catskills. You did not meet them on any IPF or UJA tour. These are zealots right out of the Second Temple. And they will bring the whole house down.
I want to remind our audience, please, if you have a question for Tom, put one in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll try to get to your questions before we end, but we're not ending yet. Oslo heralded a new era in Israel's relations with the Arab world as Israel established ties with a handful of Arab countries, although aside from Jordan, none ever pursued full diplomatic relations. You talked earlier about the Arab Peace Initiative, which I thought you revealed, but apparently you did more than reveal it. You actually wrote it, and then you let the king take credit, which was probably smart.
To tell you what I did, so it's actually, people have written, Yossi Alper in his book about it actually interviewed me, and he wrote the whole history, but it's kind of, what actually happened was, just so you know, after 9/11, Davos was in New York in honor of America. So it was in January of 2002. And I was looking to do something productive. And in those years, I used to occasionally do letters from American presidents, from Bill Clinton to different leaders around the world. It was great fun, and I'd make them up, but they're all based on facts. I used to drive different leaders crazy, including Clinton, but they're all like based on facts. So I'd never done one with George Bush, and his voice was very hard for me to get. So I decided after 9/11 to do something productive. I wrote a letter from George Bush to the heads of the Arab League. And I said, why don't you guys do something productive after 9/11? Why don't you put a peace plan on the table, calling for full Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem in return for full normalization, peace, trade, and diplomatic ties, and tourism. So I had the idea, and I went to Davos in New York at the Waldorf Astoria, and I ran into Amr Moussa, who was head of the Arab League then. I said, I'm thinking of writing this column. You think I should do that? And he said, do it. I thought, well, that's interesting. And then I ran into Andre Azoulay, who was the Jewish advisor to the King of Morocco. And I said, Andre, I'm thinking of writing this column. You think it's a good idea? He said, do it. Just do it. And so I wrote that column. And then I went to Saudi Arabia. And that's what Abdullah was referring to. And so that's how it happened.
As you know, Tom, the whole idea of the Arab Peace Initiative, or one of the fundamental notions underscoring it, was that members of the Arab League would establish full ties with Israel only after a two-state outcome was achieved. The Abraham Accords sort of departed from that paradigm. With the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, and it looks like maybe Saudi Arabia is moving that direction. Do you think that this outside-in strategy can actually be more effective at advancing Israeli-Palestinian peace than the Arab Peace Initiative? And can Israel ever aspire to broader normalization with the Arab and Muslim worlds if it continues to sideline the Palestinian issue?
So much has changed, Susie. I mean, the fact is, Palestinian movement's been lost basically for why are all these peace initiatives coming from Arabs, not from them? Why is there no democracy movement there? This doesn't have anything to do with Israel. Block every road every Saturday and hold up the Arab Peace Initiative, nonviolent. I don't believe in any of these outside things. This is resolved when it comes from inside, when the two people decide they want to make peace. That's where Oslo came from, after all. Let's not remember. I have a rule about the Middle East. The Middle East only puts a smile on your face when it starts with them. Camp David started with a secret meeting in Morocco between Tahami and Moshe Dayan. The Jordanian-Israeli peace happened in secret and then in public between Israelis and Jordanians. Oslo started. It's in Oslo between Israelis and Palestinians. The Americans were only brought in later. They have to want it. They have to own it. And I found over the years, if they don't want it and they don't want to own it, it's really and unfortunately, when you sort of wait and you miss and you miss and then you're late, and eventually just the inertia of Israeli settlements just grinds you up. And so I'm out of that business now because I just have no idea. It's a story of the policeman. A guy comes up to him and says, how do we get to Susie Gelman's house? He said, well, you wouldn't start from here. Well, you wouldn't start from here, with 500 Israeli settlers, there. And it would just take a gargantuan political effort to even carve out a two-state solution, from what you've got left, which actually Kushner did. I mean, if I were the Palestinians, I would have openly embraced the Kushner plan. Now, that would have been a head snap, you know what I mean? And always say, yes, but, we start here, okay? We get 70%, they get 30%. We want more, they get less. But if you're always waiting for perfect, it's the Middle East, Jake. Perfect ain't on the agenda. And you're up against a really relentless dynamic force in terms of the Israeli settlement movement.
So I have one more question, then we're going to turn to some audience questions. Tom, reflecting on the legacy of the Oslo Accords, what lessons should U.S. policymakers take to heart when considering an Israel-Saudi deal and parallel steps that could be taken to further a two-state outcome? Do you see such efforts as an enduring legacy of Oslo?
I should have warned everybody at the start. I can ruin any dinner party, and I do weddings and bar mitzvahs. So, I'm not on this issue in an optimistic mood. I'm just I'm not even really thinking about Oslo. I'm really happy to talk about it, and for you especially, and this great Israel Policy Forum, which has been such a voice of rationality and decency for all these years. So that's why I'm here, but I'm not here because I have any good ideas. I'm out of good ideas for that. Right now, my focus is actually trying to save Israel as a democracy, period. And we're so far away from anything that can touch the peace process right now or advance it, without a different government. But I am hoping that out of this democracy movement will come the understanding that when you have now people, like Ehud Barak, openly talking about apartheid in the West Bank, when you have a democracy movement that I hope will understand that you cannot have a healthy democracy if you are occupying the West Bank and trying to protect 500,000 settlers living cheek by jowl inside a Palestinian community that is hostile to them. And so everything in its own time. I mean, I certainly would love to see the peace process, revived, but it's going to take a different constituency on both sides. You need Palestinian elections. You need a legitimate authority there, and you need a different Israeli government. And I do hope that if I'm optimistic about one thing, it's that the Saudi that if there is normalization, in this way, that eventually we can get a reconstituting of the politics on both sides. But it's going to be very, very difficult.
And Tom, just remind me what time you need to stop so I can.
I need to stop in 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's all right. So from our audience, Neil Borovitz asked, do you think it's actually possible for Gantz and Lapid to join a coalition with Netanyahu if he jettisons Smotrich and Ben-Gvir?
It would all depend on the terms, and they'll tell you that. And of course, Gantz doesn't trust Bibi any farther than you can throw him. And for good reason.
Good reason.
Yeah, for Bibi lied and cheated him last time. I would just say it's a national emergency. I think Benny Gantz understands that. It'll all depend on the terms, but I think it's very, very important that they try. I understand if they don't, why they don't. It's a very awkward situation where you have the political parties and you have the democracy defenders movement. They are not the same thing. And so the challenge for the democracy defenders movement is the challenge of every color revolution, as it were. And I saw this really close up in Hong Kong with Occupy Central. The danger of these mass-based democracy movements is that I remember getting to Hong Kong at the height of Occupy Central and asking our bureau there, I said, I'd like to interview one of the leaders of Occupy Central. And they said, well, there is no leadership. It's just a bottom-up movement. I said, well, but wait a minute. They issued 5 demands. They said, oh, those were crowdsourced. I said, really? Who decides when you compromise on demand number 3 in order to secure demand number 1? And they could never do that. And they turned down 2 offers from Beijing that would have left them in a much stronger position than they are now, and they lost the whole thing. And that's actually the history of these movements. And so the real danger is that all this effort in the streets has got to be turned into politics ultimately. It's got to be turned into political power and political decision-making. Now, the court has its own dimension of this, and it's really carrying it forward, the Israeli Supreme Court. But there's going to have to be a reshuffling Israeli politics, because I've met some amazing new people through this democracy movement. I mean, there's a whole new political leadership that emerged here. And these people are tough, they're smart, they're organizers, And so out of this and the old parties is going to come some new political configuration in Israel. I don't know what it's going to look like, but you've got this really awkward moment here. And all I say to everybody is, don't, understand that if you go for a whole loaf now, you could be like Occupy Central. You could be like Tahrir Square, and that you've got to figure out how to translate some of this into hard power. And that's my just 2 cents from the peanut gallery.
So this is very consistent with a question from Stuart Abramovitz. Does the lack of coordination among leaders of the democracy movement concern you? And would you encourage its leaders to run for Knesset? It sounds like the latter you're saying, yes, definitely.
Yeah, I don't have to encourage them. They will. I mean, there's some amazing people that came out of this movement. I've talked to their leadership several times. I've talked to some of the people from all spectrums of it. And I didn't know any of these people. They're pretty amazing. And they understand, hey, we were just doing our thing, high tech or flying jets or whatever it was. And we thought the system would just take care of itself, as it always did. And then it didn't. And I think they understand now that they got to stay and they got to dig in and they got to fight,
Our mutual good friend, Charles Bronfman, wants to ask you, Tom, how can a boss make a deal when we hear that he wants his legacy to highlight his recent major anti-Semitic statements, which he hopes, as it said, that he wants to be considered right up there with Arafat as defender of the Palestinian people?
I mean, his time has come and gone. It's just I love Charles, but I don't. They need to have elections. Talk about people who need a new leadership, from the ground up. No more of the Tunis boys, no more of the Beirut guys. They need an organic leadership. There's some incredibly impressive Palestinians. Some of them are in prison, but we know who they are, and both sides have got to move to,
We have a number of questions following up on that, Tom, about the post-Abbas future. Is there any hope for even a semblance of a peace process with the new Palestinian leadership after Abbas leaves the scene, or will it be a more radical leadership?
I don't know. I think you'll have actually both, not either or. You see that with the Lion's Den, a kind of youth movement in places like Jenin that are have no respect for the older leadership, feel they've gotten them nothing, and are taking a violent course, but through that course, or through that generation, you may see I assume you will see a new leadership emerge, but they've got to make a transition, a legitimate transition though, and have elections and some kind. And by the way, if Hamas wins, let Hamas win. I mean, then they will have the burden of responsibility and negotiating, and that's how this is going to change. I mean, but you have to have legitimate leadership. What good is it otherwise if people aren't connected?
Tezkan Inanlar, I hope I pronounced your name right. How can the democracy movement bring Arab citizens of Israel to the cause?
A really good and important question, and I don't know. I think that they're so focused right now on saving Israel generally as a democracy, that all the issues plaguing the Israeli Arab community now, this incredible, awful outbreak of violence, within Arab communities and assassinations and killing. It's shocking. That's the responsibility of every and any Israeli government cabinet to deal with, and it will be whatever comes out of this democracy movement. But you just hope that we're seeing a kind of revolution happening in Israel right now. It's a kind of a Jewish intifada, and out of the Palestinian intifada came all kinds of changes we could not predict or anticipate. And I can assure you the same will happen here. I can't assure they'll all be good, but I think that this is an incredibly plastic moment in terms of malleability in Israel now, one that we haven't seen in a long time. And people are aroused, they're motivated, they've crossed lines, Air Force pilots not reporting for reserve duty, and stuff we never anticipated. And so, and I think if Netanyahu he's coming to New York for the UN, and boy, that is going to be pay-per-view, because I think Israelis in New York and democracy defenders, they already lit up the UN. I mean, these people are smart, and they're tough, and he is actually going to draw so much attention. He did all these interviews before the vote in the Knesset, and each one, contained some lie or half-truth, to the point where I like never tweet, but I did tweet, hey, American journalists, if Bibi Netanyahu is calling you for an interview, that's not a compliment. That's because he thinks you will be his useful idiot. So either roll up your sleeves and understand every one of these issues, but don't sit there like a stage dummy and let him just talk to you, okay? But I think he gave like 20 some interviews. I think they're all a waste, because if he comes to New York and you see Manhattan tied up by Israelis protesting Netanyahu, somebody in Congress might see that. Maybe even someone in AIPAC might see that. And maybe someone in AIPAC might say to someone else in AIPAC, hey, what does the I in AIPAC stand for? Who is the I in AIPAC? They need to ask that question.
So I think we have time for one more question, Tom, if I may. Unlike in 2020, when the Palestinians entirely rejected the Abraham Accords, the PA seems to be taking a different approach and engaging in dialogue with the US and the Saudis about what they would like to gain through an Israeli-Saudi deal. How do you see the PA's active involvement in the process impacting prospects for a normalization deal that actually furthers the goal of two states?
I think it's great. I'm so glad they're doing this. They're going to make it hard for Netanyahu, not easy. They've got some of their best people negotiating it, and people who really are knowledgeable. And I said, the Saudis really don't know a lot about this. So you need the Palestinians in there telling them what is differentiating, what is important, what has weight, what will have impact, what will improve the lives of our people. And so I think that's really good. And it heralds, I think, some real possibilities. So, I'm kind of sorry I'm 70, because this is a really amazing time. And I do want to live long enough to see how this ends, because this is like, wow, this is like every day something you never saw before. So I'm always, it's true I can ruin any dinner party, as I said, but deep down I'm still a kid from Minnesota, and I'm always looking for Minnesota and hoping that somehow things will come out well. So keep fighting, keep doing what you're doing. You're doing great work. Everybody should support the Israel Policy Forum. I've been a friend of this group from its inception, and Shana Tova to everybody.
Thank you, Tom. And by the way, you got another 50 years ahead of you, Ad 120, so you got a ways to go here.
Inshallah.
Thank you so much for joining us, Tom. And
Sure.
Folks, you heard it from Tom, not just me. If you enjoyed this webinar and our other offerings, our podcast, Israel Policy Pod, our weekly Kaplo column, and all the tools that we have on our website, please support our work by visiting israelpolicyforum.org/support. The recording of this webinar will be posted on the briefings page of the Israel Policy Forum website. You can also visit the Israel Policy Forum website to access recordings of previous briefings and sign up to receive the Kaplo column. So please stay tuned for an announcement regarding the next Israel Policy Forum video briefing. Until then, thanks so much for tuning in. Thank you, Tom. And we'll see you again soon. Shana Tova to everybody. Thank you.